She signed the divorce papers without a single tear. The courtroom on the 14th floor of the Cook County Courthouse smelled like recycled air and old carpet, and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into public buildings when too many lives have been decided inside them. The fluorescent lights ran in parallel strips across the ceiling and hummed at a frequency just below hearing, just above comfort. A clerk sorted documents behind a partition of frosted glass. A bailiff stood near the door with his hands clasped and his eyes on nothing. Nora Ashford sat at the table on the left side of the room and kept her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight and her face still. She was 31 years old. She was wearing a charcoal wool dress she had chosen that morning with the same deliberate care she gave to everything, not because she wanted to look a particular way, but because she understood that the day required a kind of armor, and clothing was the first layer. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face. No jewelry, except the thin gold wedding band still on her left hand. She had not removed it yet. She was waiting for the right moment, the way you wait for the right moment to say something true that cannot be unsaid. Callum Voss arrived at 9:47 with 2 attorneys and 3 men whose jackets fit poorly in the shoulders for reasons that had nothing to do with tailoring. He walked into the courtroom the way he walked into every room, as if the space had been arranged in advance for his arrival, and the other people in it were props someone had placed there to fill the background. He was 44 years old, dark-suited, the top button of his shirt open, and he moved with the specific gravity of a man who had spent 2 decades making other men step aside. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were darker than brown in the institutional light. He did not look at Nora when he sat down. That single fact told her everything she needed to know about the last 5 years. His lead attorney, a man named Albright, who billed at $1,200 an hour and had a voice that belonged in a courtroom, the way a blade belongs in a sheath, slid the documents across the table. Yellow tabs protruded from the edges like small flags marking occupied territory. Albright leaned close to Callum and said something low and technical about disbursement schedules. Callum picked up the pen. It was a Mont Blanc, black and gold, the same pen he used to authorize shipments that crossed state lines in the bellies of refrigerated trucks. He held it the way he held everything, like it was already his. He signed his name 3 times without reading a word. Nora watched his hand move across the paper. She had studied those hands for 5 years. She knew the scar along the base of his right thumb from a knife fight in South Boston before she knew him. She knew the way the tendons flexed under the skin when he gripped a steering wheel at 2 in the morning. She knew the way those hands used to reach across the bed in the early years when something woke him in the dark, reaching for her before he was fully conscious, before the performance of not needing anyone had fully resumed. She had held those hands back then. She had understood something about him in those moments that he would never say aloud, that the violence of the life left marks on the inside that the outside was built to hide. He signed without looking at her. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs beneath the table and felt the solid weight of her own stillness. "Done," Callum said. He capped the pen and set it beside the papers with the precision of a man closing a transaction. Then he lifted his eyes to her for the first time that morning. His gaze was the particular kind of cold that comes not from cruelty, but from the long practice of converting feeling into strategy. There was no heat in it, no residue of what had been. "The apartment on Lakeshore Drive is yours. Through end of year," he said. "The account transfers occur on the first of the month. You will not need to work. You will not need anything." Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands, at the thin gold band on her left finger, and she turned it slowly with her thumb. Once, twice. She thought about how easily it came off. She had expected it to resist the way things resist when they have been in one position long enough. It came free, without any resistance at all, as if it had been waiting. She placed it on the table between them. The gold caught the fluorescent light and threw a small, cold reflection across the surface of the signed papers. Neither of them moved toward it. "I hope," Nora said, and her voice was level, the way deep water is level above whatever moves beneath it. "I hope you never discover what you just threw away." Callum stared at the ring on the table. A muscle moved in his jaw. Something passed through his eyes that he did not name and did not allow to land before he stood and buttoned his jacket and walked out of the courtroom without the ring, without looking back, without any visible sign that the last 5 years had weighed anything at all. The door closed. The bailiff shifted his weight near the far wall. The clerk, behind the frosted glass, continued sorting paper. The fluorescent lights continued their low hum. Nora sat for 3 minutes without moving. She let the silence of the room collect around her. She did not cry. She had made that decision 2 nights ago, on the night of the phone call, and it had not felt like a decision at the time so much as a door closing gently in a house she was already leaving. Outside on Clark Street, the November wind came off the lake with nothing to slow it down and hit her face like cold hands. She descended the courthouse steps with the careful footing of someone who had decided to pay attention to every step. No driver, no security. She had told Albright she would make her own way. He had looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't quite fit the category they've assigned to it. Across the street, a black car idled in a no-standing zone. It was a Rolls-Royce, polished to a finish so dark it seemed to pull the gray November light into itself and give nothing back. Rain had begun to fall thin and cold, and the drops ran down the curved hood of the vehicle like something being erased. The rear door opened from the inside. Nora stood on the curb and looked at the open door for a moment. Then she crossed the street and looked inside. The woman in the rear cabin was in her 70s. She sat with the stillness of someone for whom stillness had long since stopped being an effort and become simply the default state of a body that had weathered everything it intended to weather. Her silver hair was pinned at the back of her head in a style that had not been fashionable for decades and was not trying to be. Her clothing was black silk. On her hands, distributed across 7 fingers, were rings set with emeralds so dark they were nearly black in the car's dim interior. Her eyes were gray, not the soft gray of winter mornings, the gray of gunmetal, of stones pulled from the bottom of rivers, of things that have been under pressure for a very long time. "Come in," the woman said. "You will catch your death standing in the rain." Nora got in. The door closed. The sound of Chicago disappeared. The interior of the car smelled like aged leather and a perfume so old and specific it seemed to carry its own history. The woman studied Nora with the unhurried attention of someone examining something she has been searching for across a very long distance and is now verifying against the image she has carried in her memory. "You have your mother's mouth," the woman said finally, "and your grandfather's capacity for stillness. I could see it the moment you walked out of that building." Nora kept her voice even. "You are Eleanor." "Eleanor Duca," the woman said, with a slight correction that carried no particular sharpness, simply the habit of precision. "And you are the last living heir of a family that has operated along this coastline for over a century." Nora looked at the woman steadily. "I know what you told me on the phone 2 nights ago. I want to know why now. Why after 26 years you are sitting outside a divorce court in Chicago. Because the men who destroyed your family have known you are alive for 9 months, Eleanor said. Because they have been watching you inside your marriage. Because they sent gunmen to a nightclub 8 months ago, and those gunmen were not there for your husband." The car moved through traffic. Outside Chicago continued its ordinary business taxis and pedestrians, and the gray lake flashing between buildings. "They were there for me," Nora said. Eleanor said nothing. In certain conversations, silence is the clearest confirmation. Nora thought about the night at the club, the sound of the shots, which she had not expected to be so flat and functional, nothing like the movies. The way her body had simply stopped while everyone around her moved. The way Callum had looked at her afterward, not with concern, not with the relief of a man whose wife had survived, but with the specific contempt of a man whose assessment had been confirmed. "You froze Selena. You just stood there." He had called her by the wrong name in that moment. She had never told him. There were things she had learned to leave alone. And the man inside his organization who told them where I would be, Nora said. Eleanor opened a small lacquered case on the seat beside her and produced a photograph. She held it out. It was a surveillance image, a man in profile mid-conversation in what appeared to be a hotel corridor. He had the open, trustworthy face of someone who understood that trustworthiness was a performance, and had been giving that performance for so long it had stopped requiring conscious effort. Nora had eaten dinner across from that face dozens of times. She had watched that face tell Callum that everything was under control, that the organization was solid, that there was nothing to worry about, that careful men could not manage. "Brennan Holt," Eleanor said, "your husband's second in command. He has been embedded in the Voss organization for 7 years, under instruction from the Sorrento family. He was the one who confirmed your location the night of the shooting." Nora held the photograph. and felt something move through her that was not quite the thing she would have named if she had tried to name it. It was something colder than anger and more structural, like a foundation being tested and finding to its own surprise that it is still standing. The Sorrento family, Nora said. Frank Sorrento, Eleanor said. He has run the family for 20 years out of Philadelphia. He ordered the massacre at our compound in Maine 26 years ago. He did it from a hotel room and slept soundly that night and has slept soundly every night since. Nora was quiet. Outside the car, a city went about its life. 44 people, Eleanor said. Your mother, your father, your granduncles and their wives and their children. People who had gathered to celebrate a birthday and were given no time to understand what was happening before it was over. She paused. I survived because I was in Boston that evening, a meeting I nearly canceled. When I returned, there was nothing left but smoke and what smoke leaves behind. Nora kept very still. A woman named Clara was your nursemaid. Eleanor continued. She carried you out through the service passage during the attack. She drove through the night to Portland and arranged your transport to Connecticut, where you were placed with a man named James Ashford. He was not your father. He owed the Duca family a debt that could not be paid in money, and raising you under a false name was the form that repayment took. He was a decent man. He raised you as well as he knew how. He died when I was 8, Nora said. He was killed when you were 8. The Sorrento family traced him through a financial record he should have buried more carefully. By then, his sister had already moved you to a different county under yet another name. The trail went cold. Eleanor's hands moved slightly against the leather of the seat, a small, involuntary adjustment. Until 14 months ago, when one of my people found your married name in a social registry and matched it to certain features in a photograph. Nora absorbed this. You waited 14 months to contact me. You were inside a marriage to Callum Voss. Eleanor's voice was precise. Approaching you while you were inside that household would have put you at immediate risk. Sorrento has people watching Voss operations. Any contact would have been flagged. I needed to wait for a moment when you were between positions. Today was that moment. The car had left the downtown grid and was moving north on Lakeshore Drive. The lake was iron-colored under the falling rain. Nora looked at it and thought about the man she had been married to for 5 years. She thought about the dinner tables where she had sat and listened and understood more than anyone in the room believed she was capable of understanding. She thought about the 5 years of being treated as decoration, as a pleasant surface, as something that occupied space without displacing anything. She thought about the way Callum's hand used to find her across the bed in the dark. She thought about the fact that even that unguarded reaching had not been enough for him to look at her differently in the daylight. She thought about the ring on the table in the courtroom, sitting between the signed papers under the fluorescent light, catching its own small, cold reflection. Why would I believe any of this? Nora said. It was not quite a question. Eleanor reached into the lacquered case again and produced a second photograph. This one was old, printed on paper that had softened at the edges from years of handling. A young woman holding an infant. The woman was dark-haired, with the kind of beauty that did not ask your permission, and she was looking down at the baby with an expression that held equal parts tenderness and the particular fear of someone who loves something and understands precisely how fragile the world is. Your mother, Eleanor said. Her name was Adeline. She was 23 in that photograph. You were 4 months old. Nora looked at the photograph for a long time. She took it carefully from Eleanor's hands. The paper was warm from being held. She looked at the woman's face, at the shape of the jaw, at the way the mouth curved slightly downward at the corners as if smiling required a deliberate choice. She was looking at her own face, an older version, sharper, with something in the eyes that Nora had not yet found in mirrors, but recognized the way you recognize something you have been waiting to see. Where are we going? Nora said. Eleanor looked at her steadily. That depends on you. Nora set the photograph carefully in her lap. She looked out at the rain falling on the lake. She thought about what was waiting for her if she said no, the apartment on Lakeshore Drive, the monthly deposits, the clean, careful, entirely constructed life of a woman who had been made from other people's decisions and had been mistaken by herself and everyone around her for someone who had chosen it. She thought about Callum's face as he signed the papers without reading them. She thought about the contempt in his eyes in the parking lot after the nightclub. She thought about 8 months of understanding on some level, beneath the level she was willing to name, that the attack had not been aimed at him. She thought about 31 years of performing a life that fit like a coat belonging to someone else. When she said, Eleanor reached forward and pressed a button on the console. The partition between the cabin and the driver lowered. O'Hare, Eleanor said, now. The car accelerated smoothly north. Nora did not look back at the city. She sat with the photograph in her lap and the ring in the pocket of her coat where she had placed it before standing from the table. And she watched the rain fall on the lake until the lake disappeared behind them and there was only the highway and the gray sky and the direction they were moving. The compound in Kennebunkport, Maine, stood on a point of land that jutted into the Atlantic like a question mark someone had pressed into the coastline. Nora saw it first from the car window as the convoy came around the final bend of a coastal road that had been narrowing for 20 minutes, the ocean appearing and disappearing between the pitch pines, and then the trees ended, and there it was. It was not a house. Houses were things people lived in. This was something older than that, something built with the understanding that what it contained needed protecting, and that protecting things required walls and height and the willingness to be seen as something that did not welcome approach. The stone was granite dark, with coastal damp the color of the ocean, on days when the ocean was not feeling generous. The structure rose 3 stories at its main block, with wings extending to either side, and a seaward facade of narrow windows that caught the late afternoon light and held it like small fires. Iron fencing ran the perimeter. Bare November trees stood inside the fence at intervals, their branches black against the gray sky. The gates opened as the convoy arrived. Inside the grounds were quieter than the exterior suggested. Stone paths between dormant garden beds, a fountain that had been shut off for the winter, men in dark clothing walking the perimeter in pairs, not pacing, moving with the economy of people for whom this was simply the work. Eleanor led her through the front entrance into a hall that ran the full depth of the ground floor. The floors were wide plank oak worn smooth by generations of feet. The walls were hung with portraits. Nora stopped. The faces, looking down at her from the gilded frames, were in some essential and disorienting way her own face. Not exactly, but close enough that her chest tightened with the specific pressure of recognition when you encounter something you did not know you had been missing. The same dark eyes, the same set of the jaw, the same slight downward curve at the corners of the mouth that she had spent her entire life assuming was simply a feature of her face and now understood was a feature of a bloodline, generation after generation. Women and men both, but the women more numerous than she expected, and each of them carrying in their painted eyes the same quality she had seen in the photograph of her mother. Not cruelty, not softness either, something more precise than either. The absolute certainty of people who had decided who they were and had never been persuaded to revise that decision. "Your mother hangs at the end," Eleanor said. Nora walked the length of the hall. The portrait at the end showed a young woman of perhaps 23, dark-haired, with a face that seemed too young for the expression it carried. The expression was not anger, though it contained anger. It was the look of someone who had already finished the argument before it began. "She looks like she has already decided," Nora said. "She always had," Eleanor replied. "It was her greatest strength. It was also the thing that made her difficult to protect because she never believed she required it." Nora stood in front of her mother's portrait and felt something she did not have a ready word for. Not grief exactly. Grief was for things you had and lost. This was something different. The weight of an absence you had never known was an absence until the moment it was named. "Training begins tomorrow," Eleanor said. "Tonight you rest. Tomorrow we begin the work of finding out who you are when you are not performing someone else's idea of you." Nora slept badly that first night. The room they gave her was on the second floor, facing the Atlantic, and the ocean moved in the darkness outside the window with a sound like breathing, like something enormous and patient, keeping time while everything smaller sorted itself out. She lay on a bed that was older than any building she had lived in and stared at the ceiling and let her mind run its circuits. Callum, the courtroom. Brennan Holt's face at 100 dinners, warm and careful, and entirely manufactured. James Ashford, the quiet man in the Connecticut house who she had loved and lost at 8, and mourned without fully understanding what she was mourning, not just the man, but the ground beneath the man, the foundation she had believed was solid. All of it constructed, every wall and ceiling of the life she had known. She got up before dawn and stood at the window in the dark and watched the Atlantic show itself in gray increments as the light came. The water was dark and enormous, and moved with the indifference of something that existed before any of them and would exist after all of them, and did not particularly register the events of their lives. She thought that was not comforting in the way people claimed the ocean was comforting. She thought it was simply honest. At 7 in the morning, she found the stone courtyard behind the main house. Declan Marsh was already there. He was 48 years old, built in the way of men who have spent their lives in physical work that was not performed for appearance, but for function. His head was shaved, his face held a collection of scars. She would later learn to catalog the one along his left jaw from Fallujah, the one above his right eye from a situation in Colombia, that he referred to without details, the one across the back of his right hand, that he never explained at all. He was standing beside a wooden table in the center of the courtyard, and on the table was a Glock 19 disassembled, its components arranged with the neatness of something that had been taken apart many times. He looked at her when she came through the door. He did not greet her. "Put it together," he said. Nora looked at the table. She had fired a weapon exactly once in her life, a single afternoon at a range in Scottsdale 4 years ago, a birthday outing organized by one of Callum's associates. She had held the weapon at arm's length and flinched at the noise, and everyone had laughed in the way of people who expected exactly that. "I do not know how," she said. "That is obvious," Marsh said. "Put it together. I just told you I do not know how." He looked at her for a moment. His expression did not change. "You have 30 seconds, starting now." She stared at the components on the table, the barrel, the slide, the spring small and silver and precise, the frame, the magazine. She picked up the frame because it was the largest piece and felt the weight of it and set it back down. Marsh swept the components off the table with one arm. They clattered across the stone courtyard floor. "Again," he said. He bent and gathered the pieces with efficient movements and replaced them on the table in the same arrangement. "Watch first." He assembled the weapon in 4 seconds. His hands moved the way machines move, without hesitation, without searching each motion the conclusion of a motion that preceded it. Slide, spring, barrel, frame, magazine. The click of the assembly seating was clean and final. He disassembled it again and placed the components on the table. "Again," he said. She tried. Her fingers found the slide and lost it. The spring resisted and then slipped. She spent 40 seconds searching for the correct orientation of the barrel before Marsh reached out and turned it 90 degrees without a word. She did not assemble it in 30 seconds that morning. She assembled it in 6 minutes on the 5th attempt, but she assembled it. That first morning set the tempo for what followed. Marsh was not cruel, and he was not kind. He was precise. He corrected without commentary and repeated without impatience, and held a standard that did not lower because she was new to the material. She came to understand that this was itself a form of respect, the refusal to reduce the expectation because he believed she could not meet it. The days developed a structure. Firearms in the morning when the air off the Atlantic was cold enough to keep the mind sharp. Hand-to-hand contact work in the late morning, which she found harder than the firearms. Not because of the physical demands, but because it required her to be hit repeatedly, and to understand from the inside what force felt like coming at her before she could understand how to redirect it. Afternoons were different. Eleanor's senior advisor, a former federal prosecutor named Whitmore, who had crossed the floor of that profession 20 years ago and never looked back, brought her into the library and spread intelligence files across the long table and talked for hours about the architecture of organized criminal finance, about how money moved and how it hid, and how the hiding always left traces for someone patient enough to find them. She was patient enough. That turned out to be the thing. She had spent 5 years at dinner tables where she was not expected to understand the conversation, and she had understood every word, and she had filed it away in the way of someone who does not know yet why they are keeping it, but knows the keeping is important. The analytical capacity she had been developing without context for 5 years now had a structure to inhabit. Whitmore began giving her problems that he told her took his experienced analysts 2 days to work through. She was working through them in a morning. She does not know she is doing it yet. She heard Marsh tell Eleanor one evening when she was coming down the hall, and they were in the room ahead and did not hear her approach. She sees the pattern immediately, but she still thinks it is luck. It is not luck. Eleanor said something too quiet to hear. Then Marsh's voice again. She sees the way you used to. There was a silence after that. Then Eleanor said something else still too quiet. And then the sound of a door. And then nothing. Nora stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she continued to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands, which were calloused now, in places they had not been, before the inside edges of the fingers, the base of the palm. She turned them over. She did not recognize them, and she did. She thought they were beginning to look like the hands in the portrait at the end of the hall. She thought that was exactly right. 3 months after she arrived in Maine, Eleanor called her into the main study and told her about the Atlantic City Summit. The summit was not a conference with a name or a registration or any official existence. It was a gathering that happened every 18 months, organized through encrypted channels and private coordination, attended by approximately 40 individuals who controlled the movement of money and goods and influence across the eastern half of the country. They arrived as businessmen and investors, and arrived in cars without plates, and left the same way, and the rooms they met in were swept 3 times daily for anything that listened. Eleanor had attended every summit for 30 years. She had not attended the last one, the one before Nora arrived. This one she would attend differently. The Revel Hotel in Atlantic City had been the venue before, and it would be the venue again. 3 floors purchased for the duration. No civilian access. The casino floor below, operating normally, providing cover in the way that ordinary life always provides cover for what happens above it. "You will walk in beside me," Eleanor said. You will not speak unless someone addresses you directly. You will watch the room. You will use everything Whitmore has taught you about reading what people reveal when they believe they are concealing it. And at the end of the evening, you will tell me everything you observed. And Callum Voss, Nora said. Eleanor looked at her steadily. He has been invited. He attends these summits. And when he sees me, Eleanor was quiet for a moment. When he sees you, he will understand something he did not understand this morning when he signed those papers. And what he does with that understanding will tell us what kind of man remains underneath the one he has constructed. Nora thought about this. She thought about what Callum would see when he looked at her across a room full of people who understood exactly what the name Duca meant. She thought it would be the first time he had actually looked at her in years. The evening of the summit, she stood in front of a mirror in a suite on the 7th floor of the Revel, and did not entirely recognize the woman looking back. The dress was black cut with the kind of precision that is the opposite of decoration, and along its lines ran threads of deep green so fine they were invisible until the light caught them, and then they blazed. The Duca color. Eleanor had told her the family had used it for generations. The specific shade of the stones in Eleanor's rings. Her hair was down. Her hands were bare. The roughness at the base of her fingers from 3 months of training she had left exactly as it was. She was not decorating herself. She was presenting herself. There was a difference she had only recently learned to feel. Marsh appeared in the doorway and looked her over. The way a man looks at something he has had a hand in building and is now checking for readiness. "You understand what this evening is," he said. "An introduction," Nora said. "A declaration," he said. "Everyone in that room will form a position the moment you walk through the door. Some will see an opportunity. Some will see a threat. Some will begin immediately calculating what it would take to neutralize you." He paused. "Do not go to them. Let them come to you." Eleanor appeared behind him. She was in black, the kind of black that belonged to someone who had worn it for decades and had made it entirely their own. Her emerald rings caught the suite's chandelier light and threw small green reflections across the ceiling. She looked at Nora for a long moment. "Your mother walked into her first summit at 22, she said. Every man in that room believed she was there because of someone else. She left with 3 new alliances and more information than she had arrived with." She paused. She also left with the private knowledge that 2 of the men who had underestimated her would not recover from the decisions they had made that evening. "What happened to them?" Nora said. "They retired," Eleanor said, "early and involuntarily." She turned toward the door. "Come." The ballroom of the Revel occupied the entire northern end of the conference level, stripped of its ordinary function. For the evening, the furniture replaced with the informal arrangements of a gathering that understood its own power well enough not to require staging. Approximately 50 people occupied the space. The staff moved in absolute silence. The security stood at every entrance in suits that fit too well to be ordinary and not well enough to fully hide what was underneath them. Nora had studied 32 of these people in Whitmore's briefings. She could look at any face in the room and retrieve the shape of their operations, the location of their current vulnerabilities, the names of the people they were most afraid of losing. Knowledge was the first currency. She was carrying more of it than anyone in the room would expect. She walked in beside Eleanor. The room did not stop. These were professionals. They had survived by not stopping at things that surprised them. But something moved through the gathering the way a current moves through water, invisible at the surface but felt by anything swimming in it. Heads turned, conversations modulated, eyes moved across her face with the rapid and practiced assessment of people who understood immediately that something had changed in the composition of the room. She let them look. She did not return the attention directly. She moved through the space beside Eleanor, and she watched everything from the perimeter of her vision, and she filed it all, and she said nothing. The first acknowledgement came from a broad, silver-haired man near the bar who turned fully toward them and lowered his head in a gesture that was not quite a bow but was definitely not nothing. Others followed, not everyone, but enough to make the shape of the evening clear to everyone watching. The Duca name, which had been a ghost story for 26 years, was being spoken in this room with breath behind it again. Nora was standing near the eastern windows, watching a conversation across the room that was more interesting than it appeared when the doors opened again and Callum Voss walked in. She saw him before he saw her. He came in with 2 men and an attorney she didn't recognize, and he moved through the entrance the way he always moved, as if the room owed him passage. She saw the set of his jaw harder than usual, the specific hardness of a man holding something together by force rather than conviction. She saw the circles under his eyes that had deepened in the months since the courthouse. She saw his left hand move to his jacket lapel and away again in the small, unconscious gesture she had learned in year 2 of their marriage that meant he was running numbers and did not like the sum. Callum Voss was afraid. He would not name it that. He was not a man who had a ready vocabulary for his own fear, but it was there in the hardness and the circles and the gesture, as legible to her as anything Whitmore had ever spread across the library table. She watched him scan the room, the professional sweep of a man assessing exits and weight and the location of every potential threat. And then his gaze reached the eastern windows and stopped completely. He found her the way a compass finds north, not gradually, not by process, some animal recognition that bypassed thought entirely and landed in the body first, in the moment before understanding. Across 40 feet of polished floor and assembled power, Callum Voss looked at his former wife and did not look away. Nora held his gaze for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she turned back to the window and the conversation across the room and let him stand with what he had just seen. Eleanor materialized at her shoulder like something that had always been there. "He sees you," Eleanor said very quietly. "Yes," Nora said. "Good," Eleanor said, and moved away. Later, when the formal proceedings of the evening had concluded, when the arrangements had been made, and the encrypted contact details exchanged, and the room had settled into the particular ease of people who had accomplished what they came to accomplish, Callum found her on the terrace. She had positioned herself there deliberately. The terrace overlooked the boardwalk, and beyond it, the Atlantic, black and enormous. In the night, the lights of the casino district reflected in the swells in long, trembling lines. She heard his footsteps on the tile behind her and waited. He stopped 6 feet away. She did not turn. Nora. His voice was stripped of the professional surface. This was the version that only appeared when the performance had run out of fuel. She had heard it exactly 3 times in 5 years. Once, when his closest man from the early days died in a hospital in Gary. Once, in the parking lot after the nightclub. And once, only once, in the middle of the night, in the 2nd year of their marriage, when he had woken from something and she had been awake beside him, and he had said her name in the dark, the way you say the name of something you are afraid of losing. That name, she said, is not mine. Silence. She turned. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something. His face was open in a way it almost never was, the careful construction of the public Callum Voss temporarily suspended by something too large to maintain the construction against. "What is this?" he said, low, barely controlled. She let a moment pass. "This," she said, "is the answer to what you told me this morning, that I would not need anything, that I would be taken care of." She looked at him steadily. "This is what you were so certain I did not have." His jaw worked. "You lied to me. I did not know who I was for most of our marriage." She kept her voice even. "And when I began to understand, you had already decided I was not worth the conversation. You could have told me." She looked at him. She let the question sit in the air between them, and she did not answer it because she did not need to. They both already knew every dinner he had taken the call instead, every argument where he had told her directly or by implication that the world he inhabited was beyond her comprehension, every moment at the nightclub and after where her response had been read as weakness, rather than the entirely accurate awareness that the violence that night was aimed at her and not at him. "Your operations," he said, shifting register. "The shipment on the Milwaukee route. Harlow pulling out. The cruise in the South Side going dark." She met his eyes. "Your underboss," she said, "has been working for the Sorrento family for 7 years, Brennan Holt. He was placed inside your organization before you and I ever met. Every shipment he has burned, every political contact he has severed, every crew that has disappeared, that is the Sorrento family clearing the board. When you are sufficiently weakened, they will move directly on your territory and your infrastructure." She watched the information reach him. She watched the processing, the resistance, the specific devastation of a man understanding that the person he trusted most completely had been the instrument of everything being taken from him. "That is not possible," he said. But the words came out already hollow, already understanding their own inadequacy. I have his communications, account records, photographs of a meeting in Milwaukee 3 months ago. She paused. I can have the documentation to whatever location you specify. Something shifted in his eyes, the strategist reasserting itself over the man. Even now, especially now, she had always found that quality in him both admirable and heartbreaking. What do you want? He said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the railing and the dark ocean below. Tonight, she said, I want nothing. Tonight was an introduction. She pushed off the railing and moved toward the doors without hurrying. Behind her, she heard his hand come down hard on the stone railing, a single sharp impact, the sound of something releasing that had been held too long. She walked back into the light and warmth of the room and did not allow herself to look back. But she heard that sound for a long time after. She carried it with her out of the ballroom and into the elevator and up to the suite where Marsh was waiting with a tactical debrief, and Eleanor was sitting in the armchair by the window with her rings off for the first time since Maine, turning them over in her hands, one by one. And Nora set down her jacket and accepted the water Marsh handed her, and began telling them everything she had observed, from the moment they walked through those doors to the moment she walked out. She was thorough. She was precise. She missed nothing. And somewhere in the building below her, she knew Callum Voss was sitting with what he had seen and what she had told him, and the weight of understanding that the woman he had signed away that morning in a courtroom on the 14th floor of a county building while the fluorescent lights hummed was not at all what he had believed she was. She thought about the chisel and the stone. She thought about pressure and time. She thought about what gets made when both are applied in the right direction. Then she picked up the water and kept talking. And the Atlantic moved in the dark outside the window, and the night continued forward in the direction nights always go. She did not sleep that night either. The debrief with Marsh and Eleanor ran past 2 in the morning, and when it was done, she sat alone in the suite and listened to the Atlantic City boardwalk make its noises below the distant music from the casino floor, the occasional car, the ocean beyond all of it, doing what the ocean always did, which was continue without reference to any of them. She thought about Callum's face when he found her at the railing, the way the architecture of him had come apart for those few seconds before he could reassemble it. She had spent 5 years watching him perform certainty for rooms full of dangerous men, and she had never once seen the structure fail. It had failed tonight, not completely, not permanently, but enough for her to see what lived underneath it, which was the same thing that lived underneath most men who built themselves into weapons. The fear of having miscalculated something they could not afford to have gotten wrong. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window and looked at the dark water and thought that she was not done with him yet. Not even close. The drive back to Maine the following morning took 7 hours. Nora rode in the front passenger seat and did not sleep and did not speak much, and watched the coastline appear and disappear through the window as the road moved north. Marsh drove. Eleanor sat in the rear, and read through a physical file with the focused attention of someone who had been reading intelligence documents since before Nora was born. Nobody needed to fill the silence. It was a working silence, the kind that collects in vehicles carrying people who have shared a high-stakes evening and are now separately processing what it produced. What Nora was processing was the specific sensation of having been seen, not in the way she had wanted Callum to see her across 5 years of marriage, in a different way. The room full of people who understood what the Duca name meant, who had recalibrated within seconds of her entering, who had given her something without her asking, because the bloodline itself demanded acknowledgement. She had not expected to feel the weight of that. She had prepared herself intellectually for the summit. She had not prepared herself for what it would feel like to stand in a room and have people recognize something in her face that she was only beginning to recognize herself. She thought about the portrait at the end of the hall. She thought about her mother at 23, carrying that specific and ferocious certainty in her painted eyes. She was beginning to understand where it came from. Callum did not sleep that night in Atlantic City. He sat in his suite on the 9th floor with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and the Do Not Disturb function active on every device in the room, and he thought about what he had seen. He had been attending these summits for 11 years. He understood the grammar of them, who stood where and with whom, and what the standing communicated. He had watched families rise and fall inside these rooms. He had watched men arrive with power and leave without it, without a single raised voice. He understood the room's language as well as anyone who had ever walked into it, and he understood exactly what it meant that Nora Ashford had walked into that room beside Eleanor Duca while the room adjusted around her like water adjusting to a new shape. He understood it, and he did not know what to do with understanding it. He picked up his phone and put it down 3 times before he called Rowan. "Get me everything on the Duca family," he said when Rowan answered. "Historical and current. Whatever Carver can pull without tripping anything. I need it before morning." Rowan did not ask why. That was why Callum kept him. He sat with the silence after the call and thought about what Nora had told him on the terrace. Brennan Holt, 7 years. The Milwaukee shipment, Harlow, the South Side cruise. He had been running the same names through the same analysis for weeks and arriving at the same dead ends, and he had never once pointed the lens at the man sitting closest to him, because you do not point the lens at the man you trust most. That is the entire mechanism of the thing. The trust is the weapon. He thought about 15 years. He thought about the number of times Brennan had been the last man in the room with him when everything was falling apart, and had been steady and useful and exactly what the moment needed. He thought about what that steadiness had actually been, not loyalty, performance. The long, patient, expertly maintained performance of a man who had been pointed at Callum Voss like a weapon before they had ever shaken hands. He pressed both palms flat against the desk and stared at the wall and breathed. At 4 in the morning, Carver's file came through on the encrypted line. Callum read it once. Then he read it again from the beginning. Then he set the printed pages face down on the desk and did not move for a long time. He called Rowan again at 4:40. "Pull Brennan's communications," he said. 90 days. Use the external system he does not know exists. I want everything on my desk by the time I land in Boston. He was in the air before 6. Back in Maine, the compound resumed its rhythms as if the summit had been simply another day's work, which for Eleanor and Marsh it largely had been. Nora trained in the morning, a longer session than usual, Marsh pushing the hand-to-hand work past the point where her body wanted to stop, because he understood that the summit had shifted something in her, and that the shift needed to be integrated physically, not just analytically. You process through the body what the mind cannot fully hold, he had told her in the 3rd week, and she had thought that was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in years. In the afternoon, Whitmore spread new files across the library table. The Sorrento Financial Architecture. 12 shell companies across 6 states. 3 legitimate real estate holdings used as anchors for the larger structure. A network of political contacts in Pennsylvania and New Jersey that had been cultivated over 2 decades. The documentation was dense and cross-referenced and required the kind of attention that made time disappear. Nora was 3 hours into it when Whitmore leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she had learned to recognize as his version of impressed, which was the absence of the mild skepticism he wore the rest of the time. "You just identified the account linkage that took my team 4 days to find," he said. She had not known she was doing anything unusual. She thought she was simply following the thread. It was on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the summit, when everything shifted again. Nora was in the compound's lower study, the smaller of the 2 research rooms, working through a communications intercept that Whitmore had flagged as potentially significant. The room was quiet. The ocean outside was doing its night work. She had been there for 2 hours and had a cup of tea that had gone cold at her elbow, and a legal pad covered in the shorthand notation she had developed over weeks of working through documents, her own private language for tracking patterns. Declan Marsh came through the door without knocking. She knew immediately. Marsh had rules he maintained through everything. He knocked on closed doors. He had maintained that rule through 15 years of crises and operations and the kind of work that produced the scars on his face. The fact that he came through the door without knocking told her in the fraction of a second before she saw his expression that what he was carrying was bad enough to override 15 years of reflex. He set a photograph on the desk in front of her. She looked at it. It was a surveillance image taken from elevation, slightly compressed in the way of long-range photography. It showed the stone courtyard at the center of the compound. The fountain, the dormant garden beds, the paths she walked every day. And in the center of the courtyard, zip-tied to one of the iron courtyard chairs, was a man she recognized. Not from Maine, from before Maine. Carver, Callum's technical specialist, the man Callum had put on tracing the Milwaukee reroute. His face was bruised across the left side. His shirt was torn at the collar. His chest moved with the shallow regularity of someone who was alive and would remain so until whoever had arranged this decided otherwise. The photograph had been taken from a position that could only have been inside the compound walls. She looked up at Marsh. This was transmitted to Eleanor's personal secure line 40 minutes ago, Marsh said. His voice was level in the way that voices go level when the person speaking has already processed the fear and reached the other side of it. Whoever sent it was inside our perimeter when they took it. Nora looked at the photograph again. The compound at Kennebunkport was the most secured private installation on the New England coast. Eleanor had spent 30 years refining its systems, 40 guards minimum at any hour, motion detection across every exterior surface, security protocols that had not been breached in 3 decades. Inside our perimeter, Nora said. Marsh set a second piece of paper beside the photograph, a single typed line. She read it. Send the girl back to Chicago, or the old woman burns with her house. She set the paper down carefully. The girl. They were still thinking of her as the girl. Selina Vale, the quiet wife, the one who froze at nightclubs and smiled at fundraisers and occupied space without displacing anything. Their intelligence had not been updated. They were still operating on the image of the woman she had been before Maine, before Whitmore, before 3 months of Marsh, putting her through the kind of work that changes what a person is made of. That was one piece of information. The other piece was that the photograph had been taken from inside the compound walls, which meant the breach had not come from outside. It meant someone inside had let them in, or had provided what was needed to circumvent what could not be physically entered. She looked at Marsh. His face was stone. His hands were at his sides. Who has current access to the compound security rotation codes? She said. The codes rotate every 72 hours, he said. 17 personnel have access to the current cycle. She watched his face as he said it. She watched the small and nearly imperceptible quality of a man speaking words he has already tested for damage, checking each one before he lets it go. She had learned to read that kind of care in the months under Whitmore. The tells were never in the content. They were in the management of the content. Give me the list, she said. He produced a folded sheet from his jacket and held it out. She did not take it immediately. She held his gaze for a moment. The sheet stayed between them, suspended. She thought about 3 months of training, 3 months of this man's hands physically guiding her grip on a weapon, 3 months of eating at the same table and receiving his corrections, and watching him watch her, and listening to him tell Eleanor that she saw the way Eleanor used to see. She thought about how completely she had trusted that. Declan, she said, his first name, which she had rarely used. Why? He was quiet for exactly the length of time that confirmed it. The sheet of paper stayed between them. The photograph of Carver in the courtyard stayed on the desk. The ocean outside moved in the dark. It was not the Sorrento family, she said. Not their style, not their geography. Marsh said nothing. Victor Crane, she said. Still nothing, but his left hand moved very slightly at his side. Just a flex of the fingers, just enough. She thought about what she knew about Crane. Whitmore had briefed her twice. Victor Crane had been building toward a consolidation of the Northeastern criminal network for a decade. He wanted a unified structure under his control, and he needed three things to make it credible: a financial architecture, an enforcement capacity, and a name, a legitimate bloodline name that would make the consolidation look like inheritance rather than conquest. He had known the Duca heir was alive. He had been moving toward her for 9 months. He approached you before I came to Maine, she said. 10 months before Marsh said. His voice had gone quiet. Not ashamed exactly. The voice of a man who has made a decision and is now delivering the accounting of it to the person most affected. She absorbed this 10 months before Eleanor had made contact, before Nora had any idea who she was. Crane had known the Duca heir would need training. He had known Eleanor would bring in a military specialist. He had positioned accordingly. You told him my timeline, she said, my location, the structure of the compound's defenses. What he already knew through other channels, I confirmed, Marsh said. What he did not know, I provided. She thought about the hoodlum at the nightclub 8 months ago. She thought about Brennan Holt confirming her location to Sorrento. She thought about the layers of intelligence that had been built around her life without her knowledge, all of it pointing at her from different directions. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way Marsh himself had taught her during the early weeks when he would spike her adrenaline deliberately and make her fire anyway. Control the body. The body follows the mind. The mind follows the decision. The decision here was simple. She needed the information intact, and she needed Eleanor to hear it from the source. Stand up, she said. Marsh stood. Walk with me to Eleanor's room. He looked at her. Now, she said, and you are going to tell her everything, every communication with Crane, every piece of information you provided, every detail. She held his gaze and let her voice drop to the register that Marsh himself had once told her was more effective than volume in high-stakes rooms. Or I call the men in the corridor into this room right now, and we have this conversation in a way that is considerably less comfortable for you. She paused. I'd trained under you long enough to know how to make that conversation last. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. In his face, in that battered and unreadable face that she had studied for 3 months, something moved, something that in another life might have been surprise. He had trained her to be a weapon. He had not considered the possibility that the weapon would be turned in his direction. Eleanor will kill me, he said quietly. Nora looked at him. That is between you and Eleanor. Walk. Eleanor's private study was on the 2nd floor at the end of the east wing. Eleanor was at her desk when they came in, working through a document with the focused economy of someone for whom late evenings were simply the extended continuation of the day's work. She looked up when the door opened. She looked at Marsh. Then she looked at Nora. Then she looked at Marsh again. She closed the document. Sit down, she said. She listened to everything Marsh said without interrupting once. Her face was absolutely still. Her hands lay flat on the desktop. Her gray eyes moved between Marsh and the photograph and the typed threat with the mechanical precision of a system processing inputs and withholding output until the input was complete. When Marsh finished, the room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at Nora. "You brought him here yourself." "I needed the information intact," Nora said, "and I wanted to see whether he would tell the truth when given the choice." "Did he?" "I believe so." Eleanor looked at Marsh for a long time. Whatever lived in that look, Marsh received it without looking away. The particular courage of a man who has already accepted what the cost will be. "Leave us," Eleanor said. "Wait in the hall." Marsh rose and walked to the door and went out without another word. The door closed in the silence that followed. Eleanor's hands, those emerald-ringed hands that Nora had come to understand as a kind of index to the old woman's interior state, trembled very slightly against the desktop, only slightly. Then they stilled. "Crane has been building toward this for years," Eleanor said. Her voice was very quiet. "I knew he wanted the network absorbed. I did not know he had reached Declan." She stopped. "What I underestimated was his timeline." Nora pulled her chair closer to the desk and spread the notepad she had brought with her. She had been thinking since the moment she saw the photograph. She had been running the scenario in her mind and checking it for holes, and there were not as many as she would have liked. "Crane will make a formal approach now," Nora said. The message was theater. He wanted us to know he had reach inside the compound. He wanted us afraid and off balance. His next move will be to present himself as a resolution. He will offer terms, full absorption of the Duca network under his structure, with me positioned as a figurehead. Eleanor looked at her. "And if we refuse," Eleanor said, "he burns the compound. He kills me. He takes you alive because he needs the bloodline, and he places you in a position you cannot refuse." Nora nodded. She kept her voice level. "At the same time, Sorrento still has active interest in eliminating the bloodline entirely. Two threats moving from different directions. And the only significant military resource in our range is currently operating with a damaged intelligence structure because its underboss was working against it from inside for 7 years. Eleanor said nothing. She was watching Nora, Nora said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me what you are thinking." Nora looked at the notepad. A Sorrento consolidation of Voss territory creates a corridor between their Philadelphia operations and Crane's northeastern network. If that connection forms, we are fighting both threats simultaneously, with no allied infrastructure and a compromised compound. She looked up. "If I bring Callum in before that corridor closes, we have military capacity on the ground, port access on the eastern seaboard, and a network that Sorrento has been trying to dismantle rather than one that is already intact." She paused. "We also have someone with 15 years of direct operational experience against Sorrento infrastructure. And you believe he will cooperate," Eleanor said. "He has already lost too much," Nora said. Brennan has been taking the operation apart for months. He does not know yet how much. When he reads the full communication logs, he will understand that there is nothing left to defend alone. She was quiet for a moment. A man with nothing left to lose and something left to fight for is a different kind of resource than a man who believes he is untouchable. Eleanor studied her granddaughter across the desk for a long time. The emerald rings caught the lamplight and threw their small green constellations against the wall. "Your mother said something very similar once Eleanor said about your father." Nora waited. "She was wrong," Eleanor said simply. The silence between them lasted several seconds. Nora held it without filling it. "I know," she said finally. Eleanor looked at her. "Do you?" "I know what he is. I know what he has done and what he is capable of doing, and the specific ways in which he is still blind to things he should have seen years ago." She met her grandmother's eyes. "I also know that the people trying to destroy both of us are the same people who murdered my parents, and I am not willing to let them succeed because I chose the clean option." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across the desk and pressed 2 fingers against Nora's wrist. Not a grip, not restraint. The weight of a hand that had been carrying things for decades and was acknowledging without sentimentality that it recognized the weight beginning to distribute. "Make the call," Eleanor said, "but understand this. Whatever Callum Voss is to you, he is not the story. He is a tool. The moment you confuse the two, you lose the thread." Nora looked at her grandmother's hand on her wrist. She thought about 5 years. She thought about the courthouse. She thought about the railing in Atlantic City and the sound of his hand coming down on the stone. "I understand," she said. She called him from the East Wing corridor at 4 in the morning, standing at the window that overlooked the Atlantic in the dark. The line connected on the second ring. He had been awake. She had not expected otherwise. "Listen carefully," she said, "because I am going to say this once, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." She heard him pull the phone closer. "Brennan Holt has been working for the Sorrento family for 7 years. She kept her voice precise and level. "He is responsible for the Milwaukee shipment. He pulled Harlow. He is the reason your South Side cruise disappeared. The Sorrento family plans to move directly on your territory within the next 30 to 45 days. Brennan's function has been to ensure there is nothing left to defend when they arrive." The silence on his end had texture to it. Not the silence of someone who did not believe her, the silence of someone whose architecture was coming apart and who was very carefully not letting that show in the sounds they made. "How long have you had this?" he said. 6 weeks. And you did not tell me." "I am telling you now." Another silence. She heard him breathe. "Send me the documentation," he said. "Not yet. Not until we have reached an agreement." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of agreement? The Sorrento family is not our only problem." She laid it out for him efficiently. Crane, the compound breach. Declan Marsh, the timeline of the 2 threats converging. She did not editorialize. She did not soften it. She gave him the information the way Whitmore had taught her to give information, in the order that built the clearest picture, leaving the conclusion for the person receiving it to reach themselves. When she finished, the highway noise she could hear faintly behind him went quiet. He had pulled the car over. "What do you need?" he said. "Your people and your port access." She paused. "And Brennan handled before he understands that you know. And what do I receive in return?" The complete Sorrento intelligence package. Every account, every contact, every operational detail you would need to dismantle their network from the inside out. She let a moment pass. "And the name of every political contact they have already flipped against you, so you know precisely who not to trust when this is over." Another silence. Longer. "Nora," he said, and the way he said it was different from the terrace in Atlantic City, different from the courtroom, different from the parking lot after the nightclub. It was the voice of a man who had been running numbers for 30 seconds and had arrived at a calculation that required him to say something he did not have a ready framework for. "Why," he said, "after everything? Why are you doing this?" She looked out at the dark Atlantic. "Because the people trying to destroy you are the same people who killed my parents," she said, "and I am not willing to let them win simply to make a point about what you cost me." She let that sit. "Do not make me regret telling you that," she said. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a moment, with the phone in her hand, and looked at the ocean. The sky over the water was the specific dark that precedes the dark before dawn, the deepest part of the night, the part that has stopped being yesterday and has not yet agreed to be tomorrow. She thought about what Eleanor had said. He is a tool. The moment you confuse the two, you lose the thread. She was not confused. She went back to the study and picked up the Sorrento financial file and kept working. Callum landed in Boston at 8 in the morning and was at the office building in Back Bay by 9:15. Rowan met him at the elevator with a printed file held in both hands like something that needed to be carried carefully. The communications logs ran to 63 pages. Callum took them to his private office, the inner room that nobody entered without being invited, and sat down at the desk and began reading. He read without stopping. He did not take notes. He did not make calls. He read the 63 pages from the first entry to the last, and then he turned back to page 1 and read the first 10 pages again. Then he set the file face down on the desk and placed both palms flat against the back of it and looked at the far wall. 15 years. Every strategic decision they had made together, every territory consolidated, every rival managed, every relationship with the city's political infrastructure, carefully built and maintained. All of it had been a shared project, and Callum had understood it as the accumulated product of two men who had built something from nothing together. He had understood Brennan's loyalty the way he understood very few things as a given, as a load-bearing wall, as one of the facts of the structure. The 63 pages told him that the load-bearing wall had always been someone else's. He picked up his phone. "Rowan," he said, "get me Brennan. Tell him I need a full operational briefing. Today, Boston office. Tell him to bring the current crew placements and the reserve asset locations. Tell him I want everything on paper." He heard Rowan make a note. "Anything else, tell him I said it cannot wait." He put the phone down. He sat for a moment. Then he picked it up again and called a second number 1 that did not appear in any directory associated with him and was answered on the third ring by a man who simply said, "Yes, I need you and 3 others at the Boston office before 11. Callum said, "Bring the protocols we discussed last spring, the ones Brennan does not know exist." Another yes. The call ended. Callum sat behind the desk in the room that no one entered without invitation and thought about 15 years. He thought about the first winter they had worked together, the two of them, in a borrowed office with a leaking radiator and a debt structure that should have killed the operation before it got started, and how Brennan had been the one to find the contact in the harbor master's office that solved the logistics problem that had seemed unsolvable. He thought about the hospital in Gary. He thought about the negotiations in Pittsburgh that had nearly come apart and had not come apart because Brennan had read the room and made the right move at the right moment. He thought about what all of that had actually been. He thought that a man who could perform 15 years of loyalty so completely that the performance became indistinguishable from the real thing was a very particular kind of professional, and that the people who had built that man and pointed him at Callum Voss had known exactly what they were doing. He thought about Nora on the terrace in Atlantic City, her voice completely level. "Your underboss." He thought about the 5 years she had sat in rooms full of people like Brennan and said nothing and understood everything. He thought about what it had cost her to say nothing and what it had meant that he had mistaken the silence for absence. At 10:58, Brennan Holt walked into the Boston office with a coffee from the place on Tremont Street, where the woman behind the counter had known his order for 11 years. He was smiling when he came through the door because Brennan Holt always smiled. When he came through doors, it was part of the performance, the warmth, the ease, the absolute credibility of a man entirely comfortable in his own ground. The smile lasted approximately 4 seconds. Rowan was standing inside. 3 other men Brennan recognized from the deep operational tier stood at positions in the room that were not casual. The 4th man, a quiet figure near the window, had a laptop open and a recorded call already queued. Brennan set his coffee down on the nearest flat surface. "Where is Callum?" he said. "Maine," Rowan said. Brennan looked at Rowan. Then he looked at the room. He was professional enough that what happened on his face happened very quickly. The assessment, the calculation, the decision about how to play it. He chose cooperation over confrontation. That was also professional. Confrontation in a room configured this way served nobody. What followed lasted 41 minutes and produced, among other things, 3 authenticated relay numbers for the Sorrento Communications Network, 2 account identifiers for the offshore structure Brennan had been using to route intelligence payments, and the name and position of the Sorrento asset inside the Federal Customs Authority at the Port of Baltimore, who had been facilitating the logistics disruptions. Brennan was thorough to the end. He bargained where he thought he had something to bargain with. He withheld where he calculated he could afford to. When he finally understood that both the bargaining and the withholding had cost him more than they had protected, he gave Rowan the rest. He asked one question when it was done. He asked whether it would be quick. Rowan told him yes. At 12:44 in the afternoon, an encrypted message reached Nora in the compound library. 3 relay numbers, 2 account identifiers, 1 name at the Port of Baltimore. She cross-referenced all 5 against the Sorrento communications architecture she and Whitmore had been building for 6 weeks. All 5 confirmed. She closed the file. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. She thought about Brennan Holt and his coffee from Tremont Street, and his 11 years of warmth and ease, and the complete professional architecture of a man who had been someone else's instrument from the first day she met him. She thought about what that required, the sustained attention of it, the discipline. She thought that she understood now, in a way she had not understood before Maine, what it meant to commit entirely to a thing, to let it reshape you until the shape was no longer a performance, but simply what you were. She stood up and carried the file to Eleanor's study. Eleanor was at the window when Nora came in, looking out at the Atlantic in the midday light. The ocean was gray and textured and enormous, and entirely indifferent, as it always was, as it would always be. Nora set the confirmed documentation on the desk. "Brennan is handled," she said. "All 5 identifiers confirmed." Eleanor turned from the window. She looked at the documentation. Then she looked at Nora. "Crane moves tonight," Nora said. "His positioning vehicles are already running approach routes according to the intercept from this morning. He did not intend his threat to be answered. He intended it to be complied with. He is not waiting for a response." She spread the updated compound map on the desk beside the file. "He believes our security is concentrated on the eastern approach based on what Marsh told him 2 days ago." Eleanor looked at the map. "It is not," Nora said. "Callum's people came through the western access road 40 minutes ago. They are positioned in the tree line along the lower boundary." Eleanor looked up from the map. "You invited Callum Voss's soldiers onto this compound," she said, "not with accusation, with the precision of someone who needs to understand exactly what has been done. I invited Allied personnel into a defensive perimeter for a coordinated operation," Nora said. "The distinction matters for everything that comes after tonight." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the map. She looked at the documentation. "And Crane himself," Eleanor said, "never enters the field personally," Nora said. "He watches. His vessel is anchored off Portland, 9 miles out. He will be monitoring the compound assault in real time and waiting for confirmation that the operation succeeded, which it will not. Which it will not." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, a long look, the kind that had nothing clinical in it anymore. And then Nora said, "I am going to him." Eleanor did not answer immediately. She looked at Nora the way she had looked at the portrait of Adeline at the end of the hall, with the specific attention of someone measuring one thing against a memory of another. Then she moved to the window and stood with her back to the room and looked out at the Atlantic for a long moment, And when she turned around, her face had settled into something Nora had not seen on it before. Not approval, exactly. Something older than approval. Recognition. "You will not go alone," Eleanor said. "Sarah goes with me," Nora said, "and 2 of the compound crew who know the water approach. Crane's people have seen the Duca courier vessel before. They will not flag it." Eleanor looked at the map on the desk. She looked at the positions Nora had marked. She looked at the timeline along the bottom edge, the estimated window before Crane's assault vehicles reached the compound's northern access, the 40-minute buffer Nora had built into the sequence, the margin that was either enough or was not. "Sabine has been on his vessel for 5 months," Nora said. "She will have the interior access route confirmed." Eleanor looked up. "Sabine," she said. Not a question, a recalibration. "Crane does not know she exists," Nora said. Marsh did not know. "I asked Whitmore to run her placement 8 weeks ago, before the summit, before any of this became what it has become. I wanted someone inside his operation before we needed her there." She paused. "I did not tell you because I did not want Marsh to have access to that information." Eleanor was quiet. "You have been running parallel tracks," Eleanor said. "I learned from watching you," Nora said. The old woman looked at her granddaughter across the desk with the map and the files and the documentation of everything they had built in the months since a Rolls-Royce had idled outside a courthouse in Chicago. She reached up and touched one of the emerald rings on her right hand, turning it once around her finger, a gesture Nora had come to understand was not habit, but something more deliberate, a way of grounding herself in the material fact of the family she carried. "Your mother," Eleanor said, made her first real operational decision at 24. She did not tell me about it until after it had succeeded. She paused. "I was furious with her for 3 days. Then I understood that what she had done was not recklessness. It was a different kind of discipline. The discipline of trusting your own read of the situation more than you trust the need for approval." Nora waited. "Do not get killed on that vessel," Eleanor said. She walked to the door and opened it, and Marsh was in the corridor where she had told him to wait. He looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has already received his sentence internally and is waiting for the external version to catch up. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. And in that silence was everything that 20 years of working relationship and one catastrophic decision could produce between 2 people who had been through enough together that the betrayal of it carried a specific weight that ordinary betrayal did not. "You will feed Crane the updated false positioning before 9 tonight," Eleanor said. "You will tell him the eastern perimeter is lightly staffed and the main access route is clear. You will use the channel he believes he owns." She paused. "After that, you will go to the lower level, and you will wait." Marsh nodded once. Eleanor went back inside and closed the door, and Nora stood in the corridor and looked at the man who had trained her for 3 months and then tried to sell her to the highest bidder, and she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them, where things go when they are too complicated to be named cleanly. "You taught me well," she said. Marsh looked at her. He looked older than he had looked this morning. Not from the confrontation, from something else, from the specific aging that happens when a person stops maintaining a version of themselves that was never accurate. "I know," he said. She walked past him toward the compound's vehicle bay, where Sarah and the two crew members were already preparing the boat. The Atlantic in November, at 9 in the evening, was not the ocean of summer photographs. It was dark and textured and moved with a weight that you felt through the hull of any vessel small enough to feel it a constant reminder that the water did not care about the people crossing it or what they were crossing it to do. Nora stood at the bow of the courier vessel and watched the lights of Crane's yacht grow on the horizon and ran through the operation. One final time, in the way that Marsh had taught her, not as a checklist, but as a living sequence, each step connected to the one before and the one after. The whole thing understood as a single motion, rather than a series of discrete actions. What she knew. Crane had approximately 14 armed security personnel on the vessel, plus a crew of 6. He would have received Marsh's updated report 2 hours ago, telling him the compound's eastern perimeter was thin and the main access route was uncontested. He would be watching the assault on the compound via encrypted satellite feed and waiting for confirmation. He would be comfortable. He would believe the evening was proceeding according to his design. What Crane did not know was considerable. He did not know that the assault vehicles had driven into a prepared position. He did not know that Brennan Holt had been handled 12 hours ago. He did not know that Sabine Wren, who had been working in his vessel's communications room for 5 months under a name that was not her own, had already confirmed the interior layout, the security rotation, and the location of the access hatch to the forward cabin where he would be when the evening reached its conclusion. The search beam from the yacht swept across the water in a lazy arc and passed over the courier vessel and continued without pausing. The vessel recognized, cleared, expected. Marsh's final service delivered through the channel, Crane believed he controlled. Sarah came to stand beside her at the bow. She was 29 years old and had the specific quality of stillness that Nora had come to associate with people who had been in genuinely dangerous situations. Enough times that danger had stopped producing noise in them and had become simply a condition of the environment, like cold or dark, something you dressed for and moved through without drama. She checked her weapon without speaking. Nora did the same. The motion came easily, now the same motion she had performed in a cold stone courtyard in Maine with a disassembled clock on a wooden table and a man telling her she had 30 seconds. She had not made 30 seconds that first morning. She could do it in the dark now. The courier vessel came alongside the yacht's boarding platform. A man appeared at the rail above and looked down. He spoke to Sarah in the flat, practical tone of routine security. Sarah responded with the same tone. The man gestured them up. Nora climbed the boarding ladder and stepped onto the deck of Victor Crane's yacht at 9:57 in the evening and felt the operation settle into place around her the way a well-made thing settles when all its components are correctly aligned. A security man in dark clothing was already moving toward the glass door of the main cabin, opening it with the slightly overmanaged ease of someone containing professional excitement about what the evening was about to produce. Nora walked through the door and into the light and warmth of the interior. She saw Crane before he saw her, which was how she had planned it. He was standing at a wet bar on the far side of the cabin, pouring 2 glasses of something amber, his back partially turned, the posture of a man performing relaxed authority, for a room that contained only himself and a handful of security personnel. He did not need to perform for, but performed for anyway, out of long habit. He was in his mid-50s, lean, silver-haired, with the particular physical confidence of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in most of the rooms he entered and had allowed that fact to become structural, built into the way he stood and breathed and occupied space. He turned when the door opened, and the sequence of his expression was something she filed immediately. Surprise first, genuine, and briefly uncontrolled. The surprise of a man whose intelligence had told him the girl was still in the compound at Kennebunkport and who had not adjusted that model. Then the rapid and professional recovery, the warmth coming up like a lamp being turned on, the smile that said this development was interesting rather than threatening, that he was a man for whom unexpected developments were simply new information to be incorporated. "Serena Duca," he said. He lifted one of the glasses toward her. "I was beginning to think the evening would conclude without this particular conversation." He had used the name, her mother's name, the name on the portraits in the hall, not Nora Ashford, not the constructed identity from Connecticut. He had done his research and he had used the name that was supposed to signal that he knew who she was and what she was worth to him, and that they were speaking on those terms. She walked into the room and took the glass he offered. She did not drink. She had counted the security positions during the 12 steps from the door to where she now stood. 4 personnel in the cabin, 2 on her left near the windows, 1 at the far end near the corridor to the forward sections, 1 near the bar who had moved a careful half step when she came in, all armed, all watching her with the attentive quality of men who had been told this woman was the evening's primary object and were waiting to see what form the acquisition would take. "Sit down," Crane said, settling into a white leather chair and crossing one leg over the other with the ease of a man entirely at home. "We have a great deal to discuss, you and I." She sat across from him and set the glass on the low table between them and looked at Victor Crane with the same attention she had given to the photograph on Whitmore's desk 8 weeks ago when he had first briefed her on the consolidation plan, except that the photograph had not been able to look back. He was intelligent. She had expected that. The intelligence was visible in the way he watched her, the way his eyes moved and registered and filed. He was also beneath the warmth and the silver hair and the very expensive vessel, and everything else he had assembled around himself to project the image of a man who had already one afraid. Not of her specifically, of what she represented, of the possibility that the architecture he had spent a decade constructing could be disrupted by a variable he had not fully accounted for. That fear was the thing she was going to use. She was about to speak when the glass door behind her came off its track. Not slowly, not with announcement. It came off its track the way things come apart when they have been hit by something that does not negotiate the aluminum frame, buckling, the sound of it hitting the cabin floor, still reverberating in the enclosed space, when Sarah's elbow was already across the throat of the nearest security man before his hand reached his weapon. Nora came out of the chair low and fast. The motion was something that lived in her body now rather than in her mind, the weeks of Marcia's training having moved it below the level of decision into the level of reflex. And she cleared her jacket in the same motion and had the barrel against the underside of Crane's jaw before he had finished processing the noise from the door. His amber glass fell from the armrest and hit the white floor, and the sound of it shattering was very clean in the sudden stillness of the room. His hands came up, slowly, carefully, the hands of a man who had survived long enough in dangerous work to understand that sudden movement in this precise configuration was a form of suicide. Sarah had the first man down and was managing the second. The two compound crew came through the broken doorway with weapons drawn and covered the remaining two security personnel. The man near the bar, who had started reaching, stopped reaching with the specific stillness of someone who has just recalculated his options and found them reduced to one. The whole thing took 11 seconds. Crane looked up at her from the chair with his chin angled back by the barrel and his expression doing something she had not expected. Beneath the shock, beneath the rapid processing, there was something that looked almost like appreciation. The expression of a man who can recognize a well-constructed approach even when he is on the inside of it. "Faster than I expected," he said. His voice was tight from the angle, but controlled. She pressed the barrel slightly. The appreciation adjusted. "Carver," she said, "the man your people took from the compound courtyard. Forward cabin. Now." His eyes moved to Sarah and back. "Left jacket pocket," he said. "Keycard." Sarah moved to him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and produced a keycard from his jacket without drama. She handed it to one of the crew and said 2 words. The man disappeared through the interior corridor. They waited. The cabin was very quiet. Through the windows, the Maine coast was a distant line of lights on the horizon. The ocean moved the vessel very slightly in a slow, continuous motion that nobody in the room was paying attention to. Footsteps in the corridor. Then Carver appeared in the doorway, rumpled a bruise developing along his left cheekbone, squinting in the cabin light. He took in the room in one sweep, with the professional speed of a man whose job required him to assess situations quickly, and his mouth tightened when he completed the picture. "You took long enough," he said. "Get to the boat," Nora told him. "Go with the crew." He moved without argument. She looked back at Crane. He was watching her with the particular attention of someone who has stopped performing and is now simply observing the warmth, set aside the silver-haired ease, set aside the cultivated image of the most powerful man in the room, set aside. What was left was the actual intelligence of the man, which was considerable, and which she respected as a thing separate from everything else she thought about him. Your network in the Northeast, she said, every positioned resource, every operation currently in motion. You are going to make a call in the next 10 minutes that stands everything down pending a full operational review. Crane looked at her steadily. And if I decline, she held his gaze. Then I deliver the documentation package I have been building for 6 weeks to 3 separate federal law enforcement agencies simultaneously. She paused. And to 4 of the syndicate principals currently in this region who have been privately questioning for some time whether your consolidation plan is an opportunity or a liability for their individual operations. She let that land. I have been told the question has been a source of considerable private debate. Crane breathed through his nose, the breathing of a man doing arithmetic. She watched him work through it. He was too experienced to panic and too intelligent to pretend the calculation came out differently than it did. You are not going to kill me, he said. Different from a question. A recalibration. No, because a dead crane creates a vacuum that benefits no one, including the Duca family. Correct. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. The expression of a man who can appreciate the structural elegance of something even while sitting inside it. So this is a restructuring. This is you making a phone call, she said. He made the call. She stood 4 feet away and listened to every word. His voice on the call was the performance voice, warm and authoritative, and the message was clean. A pause in current northeastern operations pending strategic review. No timeline given. All teams stand down and await further instruction. He said it with the conviction of a man who had made this kind of call before, which he had, and the call ended, and the cabin was quiet again. She had Sarah take both of his phones. She told him that one of the Duca operatives currently on the vessel would remain as a guest for the next 72 hours while the operational stand-down was confirmed and the formal terms were committed to paper. Crane looked at the woman Nora indicated. Sabine Wren stood near the corridor entrance with the quiet and complete attention of someone who had been in this room for 5 months and was finally operating at full capacity. Crane looked at her for a long moment. You had someone inside, he said. 5 months, Nora confirmed. He absorbed this. Luca did not know. Marsh did not know she agreed. Something moved in his expression again. Not appreciation this time. Something more complicated. The recognition of a man who has been outplayed at a game he believed he owned and who is experienced enough to understand that the correct response is not rage, but adjustment. The Sorrento family, he said before she turned to go. They will not accept what happened tonight quietly. Frank Sorrento has been hunting the Duca bloodline for 26 years. You have just announced very loudly that the bloodline is alive and has teeth. I know, Nora said. He will come for you personally. She picked up her jacket from the chair. I am counting on it. She walked out. The deck air hit her face, and she breathed it in, salt and cold, and the particular clarity of ocean air at night. And she stood at the rail for a moment before moving toward the boarding ladder. Below the courier vessel waited. Sarah appeared beside her without sound, and they descended together. The engine turned over, and the vessel pulled away from the yacht, and as the distance opened, Nora looked back at Crane's vessel, receding into the dark lit and steady, on the water full of a man who was sitting in a white leather chair, recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the woman he had spent 9 months arranging his plans around. She sat on the deck bench and felt her hands begin to shake. Not fear. The body releasing what it had been holding through the operation, the adrenaline finding its way out through her fingers, now that the will that had kept it locked in her chest was allowing the rest of her to exist again. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed and let the shaking run its course. Sarah sat beside her and said nothing, and that was exactly correct. The lights of the Maine coast resolved themselves into the specific configuration of Kennebunkport and the compound on its point of land as the vessel came back across the dark water. It was quiet at the compound in the way places are quiet after violence has moved through them and left, not peaceful, but emptied. The northern access road was lit with portable lights, and she could see figures moving through the tree line in the systematic pattern of a post-operation sweep. Callum was at the dock when the vessel came in. He looked at her the way she had seen him look at men coming back from operations, the rapid, involuntary accounting of someone checking for damage. The same look, but different. She understood the difference and did not name it. Crane is standing down, she said. 72 hours to formalize terms. His people at the northern access. 11 detained. 3 others did not cooperate. He said it simply, without elaboration, in the way of someone reporting a completed action that required no editorializing. Carver, she said, already inside. Rowan is with him. He paused. He complained about the bruising affecting his professional credibility. Something cracked open briefly in her chest. She pressed it closed. That means he is fine, she said. They stood on the dock while the crew secured the vessel and the compound lights moved in the middle distance, and the Atlantic continued its absolute indifference to the evening's events. The air smelled like salt and cold and the residue of the kind of work that leaves a smell, something sharp and chemical, that she suspected she would not be able to fully separate from the smell of this coastline for a long time. Brennan, she said. Handled, Callum said. Rowan confirmed at 10 last night. She absorbed this. Brennan Holt. 15 years of performed loyalty and 7 years of patient betrayal. A man who had eaten dinner in rooms she had been in and smiled at her with the warm ease of someone she had thought was one of the decent ones. Gone now, a closed account. She waited for something to feel different about the world with that account closed. It didn't. That was the part that stayed with her. And The Sorrento documentation, she said. The package released to the network contacts. Callum nodded. His financial people are going to have a very difficult week managing the internal fallout. He will not be in a position to move on anyone for at least 10 days, probably longer. It will be longer, Nora said. The account records alone will cost him 3 of his senior people. 2 of them are already looking for exits. Callum was quiet for a moment. You built this from the beginning, he said. Not an accusation. The voice of a man who has been adding things up and is arriving finally at the correct total. Since before Atlantic City, she said. He looked at her. He looked at the dock and the dark water and the lights of the compound in the distance. He looked at his own hands briefly. Then he looked back at her. I read the full Brennan file, he said. Not just the operational communications, the assessment reports he sent to the Sorrento network about you. She waited. He described you as having no strategic value, no independent threat capacity, emotionally unreliable under pressure. He said it flat. He sent that assessment 8 months into our marriage. Nora said nothing. I never saw it, he said. I did not know it existed. Would it have changed how you treated me? The question was honest, not a weapon. Simply the thing that needed asking out loud between them. The thing that the last 7 months had been building toward. Callum was quiet for a long time. The dock moved slightly under them in the water's motion. I do not know, he said. And the honesty of that, the refusal to give her the comfortable version of the answer, landed harder than the comfortable version would have. That is the most truthful thing you have said to me since the courthouse, she said. He looked at her then, something in his face that was not practiced and not managed, and not the product of 15 years of constructing the version of himself that the work required. I am trying, he said. His voice had the specific quality of something said without rehearsal. I know that does not fix what was broken. I am not asking you to act as if it does. I am trying to say the true thing instead of the useful thing. She stood in the cold, salt air on the dock of her family's compound and looked at the man she had married and divorced and pulled across 500 miles of coastline into a war that had started before either of them existed. She thought about 5 years of being invisible in the same rooms as him. She thought about the ring on the courthouse table and the contempt in his eyes in the parking lot after the nightclub and the specific quality of being dismissed by someone whose opinion you had, despite everything, continued to value. She thought also about other things, the drive through South Boston in the second year, very late, his hand finding her knee in the dark, without him seeming to know he had done it. The morning he came home with blood on his jacket that was not his own, and sat on the edge of the bed and did not speak, and she had not asked him to, and they had simply existed in the same silence for 2 hours, and that had been enough. The way he looked in Atlantic City when he found her face across the room before the professional surface had a chance to reassemble. Come inside, she said. There is still a great deal of work to do before morning. It was not forgiveness. It was not the absence of everything that had happened between them. It was something smaller and more real than either of those things. A door left open to a room that did not yet have a name. He followed her inside. Frank Sorrento came himself. That was the thing Nora had told Crane she was counting on, and the thing Callum had called a dangerous assumption, and the thing Eleanor had said would happen with the particular certainty of a woman who had been studying men like Sorrento for 50 years. He came 22 days after the night at the compound, after Crane's stand-down had been confirmed, and the formal terms committed to paper, after Carver had gone back to Boston with his bruised cheekbone and his restored professional credibility, after the Sorrento financial documentation had finished doing its work through the network, and two of Sorrento's senior captains had made contact with federal prosecutors through private attorneys, and one had left the country and was not coming back. Sorrento was 63 years old. He had run the family for 20 years out of a legitimate real estate office in Philadelphia and survived 4 attempts on his life and outlasted 3 separate federal investigations through a combination of institutional brutality and the complete and absolute conviction that history was on his side. He had ordered the massacre at the Duca compound in Maine 26 years ago from a hotel room and had experienced no meaningful consequence in the time since, and had allowed that fact to become foundational, built into his understanding of how the world worked and what he was permitted to do in it. He came to a warehouse in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. The message routing through a Sorrento-controlled channel had been specific: a direct approach, an offer of private negotiation terms to be discussed between the Duca heir and the Sorrento principal without intermediaries. The message had been drafted by Whitmore and sent through a channel Sabine had identified on Crane's vessel, a secondary line the Sorrento network believed was clean. Sorrento arrived at 7 in the evening with 10 men. Nora was already inside. She was sitting at a folding table in the center of the warehouse floor, alone under the industrial lighting, with her hands folded on the table surface and the specific stillness she had developed in Maine in her posture and her face. The warehouse was empty except for the table and the chair and the woman in the chair and the dark at the edges of the space where the industrial lights did not fully reach. Sorrento stopped in the entrance and looked at the empty space and at the woman at the table and at the dark at the edges. He was experienced enough that what happened in his face happened quickly. The assessment, the recognition that the configuration of the space was not the configuration he had expected. His 10 men spread around him with the professional paranoia of people who had lived this long by treating every wrong note as a warning. Nora did not move. Sorrento looked at her across the warehouse floor. He walked toward her, not fast, not slow. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at her face, and something moved in his expression. Something that was not fear and was not surprise, but lived in the space between them, the specific quality of a man confronting something he believed he had finished with a long time ago. "You look like your mother," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He did not sit. His men were positioned around the room. She appeared to be alone. She appeared to have come without support, without anything except the chair and the table and the folded hands. Sorrento had survived this long because he trusted appearances exactly as much as they deserved to be trusted. "Where are your people?" he said. "Everywhere," she said. They came in through the warehouse's 4 access points simultaneously. 16 Duca personnel and 9 of Callum's soldiers, moving in the coordinated silence of people who had rehearsed the sequence and were now executing it. The 10 Sorrento men were contained in 38 seconds. Sorrento reached for his weapon. She gave him credit for that. He was 63 years old, and he had been told by everything around him for 26 years that he was untouchable, and he still reached for the weapon when the room changed. It was not there when his hand arrived. He stood in the center of the warehouse with his people contained around him and looked at Nora with the eyes of a man who has spent 26 years believing a thing and is now standing inside the evidence that the thing was not true. She stood up from the table. She walked toward him and stopped 4 feet away and looked at the man who had ordered her parents killed. She had constructed him in her imagination across the months of briefings and surveillance photographs and financial files as something large and structural, a force, an architecture of violence that had shaped her entire life without her knowing it. In person, he was a man in his 60s, with age spots on his hands and a scar along his jaw that she recognized from the photographs, and the particular flat quality in his eyes of someone who had done what he had done and lived with it for so long it had stopped having weight. That was the most frightening thing about him, that it had stopped having weight. "You ordered the massacre at the compound in Maine," she said. 26 years ago. 44 people. "Yes," Sorrento said. The word came out without decoration, without apology, without the performance of remorse. Simply the acknowledgement of a man who had made decisions and had accommodated them into his understanding of himself over a long time. "My mother," she said. "My father." He said nothing. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. She thought about what she had prepared to say, and she said it. "I have spent 6 months dismantling the network that kept you protected from consequences," she said. "Your banking architecture is gone. Your political relationships in Pennsylvania and New Jersey are untenable. Your senior people are making arrangements that do not include you." She paused. "You came here tonight with 10 men because that is what you had available. That is what 6 months of systematic work looks like from the outside." Sorrento looked at her. She looked back. "I am not going to kill you," she said. Something moved in his face. "I considered it," she said. "I built the entire operation around the option, and then I understood that killing you gives you the only outcome that costs you nothing." She held his gaze. "You have been living on time that belonged to 44 people who did not get to have it. Every year, every morning, you woke up without consequence. Killing you ends the accounting. I do not want to end it." "What then?" Sorrento said. His voice was different now. The performance had come off the way cranes had come off on the vessel And what was underneath was simply a man older than she had imagined, looking at a version of something he thought he had eliminated, standing in front of him in a warehouse in Chicago. "You are going to stand in a courtroom," she said, "with documentation that makes every defense argument structurally impossible, and testimony from 3 of your own people who have already agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors." She paused. "You are going to sit in a room with lawyers and judges and the machinery of a legal system you have been purchasing for 2 decades. Except the people you purchased are no longer available, and the documentation of those purchases is part of the evidentiary package." She looked at him steadily. "And you are going to spend the rest of your life in a place where every morning is exactly the same as the one before it, and nothing you say or plan or decide matters to anyone." Sorrento looked at her for a long time. "That," she said quietly, "is what I want." The federal arrest came 11 days later. The documentation package, compiled across 6 weeks of Duca intelligence work and cross-referenced against the Sorrento financial records and authenticated by 3 independent forensic accountants, was delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia simultaneously with the formal cooperation agreements from 2 of Sorrento's former captains. The third had already provided his testimony and was in a location nobody from the Sorrento network knew about. Sorrento did not resist the arrest. That surprised the agents involved. It did not surprise Nora. She thought she understood why. A man who had ordered a massacre and built his identity around the impunity of it was not afraid of violence or of consequence. He was afraid of irrelevance. The arrest, the charges, the slow machinery of the trial process, all of it was at least a form of significance. What she had described in the warehouse, the room where every morning was the same and nothing he said mattered, was something else entirely. The compound in the weeks after was quieter than it had been since Nora arrived. Not empty. Eleanor's operation did not stop. The intelligence networks continued. The financial architecture continued. The relationships that had been rebuilt at the Atlantic City Summit continued developing in the directions they had been pointed. But the specific quality of pressure that had lived in the compound's walls since Nora's first night, the siege readiness, the awareness of converging threats, began to ease the way pressure eases when a sealed system is finally opened. She felt it in her body. The releasing of something she had been holding so long it had become indistinguishable from her own structure. One evening, 3 weeks after Sorrento's arrest, she found Eleanor in the garden behind the main house. The garden in November was dormant. The beds covered the fountain dry, the bare branches of the ornamental trees black against the gray coastal sky. Eleanor was sitting on a stone bench that had been there, Nora had been told, since the compound was built. She was not doing anything. She was simply sitting with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the Atlantic, which was visible between the trees in its winter configuration, dark and serious and moving with the weight of the season. Nora sat beside her. The bench was cold through the fabric of her clothing. She sat with it. "Marsh," she said after a while. "Gone," Eleanor said. He left the day after the compound operation. I gave him the option of leaving. Why? Eleanor looked at her hands. The rings were there, all 7, the emeralds dark in the flat afternoon light. He was wrong, she said, and he knew that he was wrong. And 20 years of service does not disappear because a man made a catastrophic decision at the end of it. She paused. Also, she said, and her voice shifted slightly, killing him would have felt like grief. I have done enough of that. Nora absorbed this. He trained me well, she said. He did, Eleanor said. Whatever else he was, he saw what you were capable of before I did. Before you did. She paused. That was his last useful act, I suppose. The light over the water was going gold and then copper as the sun worked its way toward the horizon. The sound of the ocean was steady and consistent, and had been steady and consistent since before any of them existed, and would continue to be. Your mother would have liked you, Eleanor said, not as sentiment, as a factual statement. She liked very few people. She had no patience for people who performed themselves rather than simply being themselves. She paused, but she liked people who looked at what they were and decided to be it completely, without apology. Was she happy? Nora said. Eleanor considered this for a long time. The way she considered things that deserved real consideration. She was alive, she said finally, fully. Every day she was exactly as present as it is possible for a person to be. I think for Adeline, those two things were the same. Callum left Maine on a Thursday morning. He had stayed 3 weeks longer than either of them had initially framed the arrangement, the operational necessities of the crane formalization, and the Sorrento aftermath, extending his presence in a way that had been professional and had also been something neither of them named or addressed directly. He had worked alongside the Duca personnel with the adaptability of a man who understood that environment was simply environment, and that if the environment required adjustments to how he operated, he adjusted. He adjusted imperfectly. There were 2 moments in high-pressure operational discussions where the old instinct surfaced, and he spoke across her in rooms where people were looking to her for direction. Both times she had waited until he finished and then continued as if the interruption had not occurred. Both times he had caught himself and said nothing afterward, which she understood was its own form of acknowledgement, imperfect, not dishonest. The morning he left, she walked with him to the vehicle bay. His bags were already loaded. Rowan was with the car. The compound was beginning the first movements of its morning. The guard rotation, shifting the kitchen, starting its work, the smell of coffee, reaching even the stone of the outer yard. Callum stopped at the vehicle and turned. He looked different from the man who had walked into the Revel Hotel in Atlantic City. Different from the man who had signed papers in a Chicago courtroom without reading them. The difference was not time. It was what happened to a person's face when the assumptions they have organized themselves around are removed and replaced with something more accurate and less comfortable. He looked cleaner, more specifically, himself, as if something that had not quite belonged had been taken away. What is left of the Boston operation is still functional, he said. The port infrastructure held. Sorrento's takeover never completed, so the network contacts are still in place. It will take a year to rebuild properly. Maybe two. He looked at her steadily. The arrangement we outlined, the Duca interest in the Eastern distribution structure. That still holds. It still holds, she said. Then we will need to be in the same rooms occasionally. New York, Boston, wherever the work requires. Yes. He held her gaze for a moment. That is all I am asking for, he said. The work, the same room, whatever that becomes. She looked at the man she had loved and resented and mourned and used and fought beside, and was still in the place where honesty lived, beneath strategy not finished with. She thought that was a true thing, and she was not afraid of it. That is enough to start with, she said. Something moved through his face, not relief, something quieter, the expression of a man receiving not what he wanted, but what he had actually earned, and understanding perhaps, for the first time, the difference between those two things. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced something small. She knew what it was before she saw it. The gold band from the courthouse table. The ring she had placed between the signed papers under the fluorescent light on a Tuesday morning in November, when the world she had been living in was still the only world she knew. She had assumed it was gone, left on the table, lost in the machinery of that day. He had kept it. Not now, she said. She said it gently. Don't mistake this for now. I know, he said. He held it out. I am just returning what was yours. She took it. The weight of it was the same as it had always been, and entirely different. She held it for a moment, and then put it in the inside pocket of her jacket close to her chest. Not as a symbol of what had been lost or what might be recovered, but as a material fact, a small specific object that belonged to a story that was not finished being written. Safe flight, she said. He got in the car. She stood in the vehicle bay and watched the convoy move through the compound gates and onto the coastal road, and she watched until the last vehicle went around the curve, where the pitch pines closed in and the road was empty, and the sound of the engines dissolved into the general sound of the morning, the birds and the wind, and the ocean underneath everything. Then she turned back toward the main house. Eleanor was standing in the doorway at the top of the stone steps. Her rings caught the early light. Her gray eyes held Nora's from across the yard with the complete equanimity of a woman who had been looking for her granddaughter for 26 years and was in no particular hurry to look away now that she had found her. Nora climbed the steps. Well, Eleanor said. Well, Nora replied. They went inside together. The portrait hall was quiet in the morning light. The faces looked down from their gilded frames as they always did, each of them carrying in their painted eyes that quality she had come to understand as the defining characteristic of the bloodline, not cruelty, not ambition, but the specific and unqualified certainty of people who had looked at what they were and had decided to be it without apology or revision. She walked the length of the hall slowly. She let herself be seen by the dead and let them remind her of what she was made of. She stopped in front of her mother's portrait, Adeline Duca at 23, ferocious and present, and carrying in her eyes the full weight of a life that knew exactly what it was. Nora looked at her mother's face for a long moment. She thought about what Eleanor had said in the garden, fully present, every single day. She thought about the portrait and the massacre and the nursemaid who had carried an infant through a servant's passage in the dark and driven through the night to Portland. She thought about James Ashford in Connecticut, who had raised her with the particular care of a man repaying a debt he could never fully repay. She thought about 5 years in Chicago, and a courthouse and a ring on a table, and a Rolls-Royce idling in the rain, and a stone courtyard in Maine in the cold, and a weapon assembled and reassembled until the motion lived in the hands below the level of thought. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and felt the ring there, the small, specific weight of it. She kept it there. She continued down the hall to the window at the far end, the window that faced east, and she stood before it and put her hand flat against the glass and looked out at the Atlantic. The ocean was enormous in the morning light, blue-gray and textured and moving with the indifferent power of something that existed on a scale that had nothing to do with any of them. It had been here before the compound, and before the Duca family, and before the country the compound stood in. It would be here after every name in this hall was forgotten. She stood with her hand against the cold glass and looked at it and breathed. The light moved on the water, and the water moved under the light, and the morning continued forward in the direction. Mornings always go. She stayed there for a long time, just breathing. That was enough.